You're listening to the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast, where we build healthier lifestyles, elevate your well-being, and transform lives. Welcome to BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on Beyond Measurements and Image. Today we're going to talk about VO2 max. And VO2 max is a little bit of a complicated subject. I'm going to give it my best shot. So VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can use or consume during intense exercise. And it's really the leading indicator for cardiovascular fitness. It does multiple things. It correlates better with the person's physical fitness. So the higher the number, the more physically fit a person is. It correlates better with physical fitness and actually is a great marker of longevity. An elevated VO2 max lowers your risk of cardiovascular disease. And it's interesting, when you look at the VO2 max levels, as your VO2 max rises, your mortality from all causes, that means the death from all causes, goes down. So the higher your VO2 max, the lower your all-cause mortality is across the board. So it's a very powerful biometric marker that we can use. But it's also a very efficient marker because it gives us a global picture of our cardiovascular fitness that just can't be faked. It just can't be artificially inflated or made up. And the reason being is that it encompasses so many different facets of physical fitness. So imagine if someone wants to know how strong you are, right? You would maybe tell them how much you could bench press or what you could squat. You would give them some number that would mean something to them, right? How many pull-ups you can do or push-ups. But really, in the weightlifting world, it would be more like your 1 rep max of any particular given Olympic lift. Or if you wanted to talk about like running, oftentimes people would give you like their pace for a mile, how quick they can run a mile, or maybe how quick they ran a 5K. But that's really more of a marker of speed. That's not so much a marker of power or physical fitness. Now, there's some correlation, of course, but just in and of itself. But when you look at VO2 max, it's telling you a whole lot about the system as a whole. And you can't alter your VO2 max in short order. Now, you can definitely alter your VO2 max over time. You can improve it, and you can also let it fall apart. But you can't fake it. You can't start running or start going to the gym or do something for, just a month or two and all of a sudden have a significantly different VO2 max. So let's talk a little bit about what it means. Just a very basic overview here. When we breathe in, we pull in air into our lungs and we extract the oxygen from that. And within the capillaries of our lungs, the blood that's flowing through it, the oxygen transfers into the blood and the CO2 from the blood transfers out and back into our lungs. So when we inhale, we're inhaling in oxygen and then we transfer that over to our red blood cells. In turn, the CO2 that's sort of on the back end of the cycle diffuses back into our lungs, and when we exhale, the CO2 goes out. That's important to remember, and I'll go over that again, but when we're doing the testing for VO2 max, those are some of the parameters we use. But let's go back. So when we inhale oxygen, and that oxygen diffuses into the red blood cells and it binds to the hemoglobin in our blood. And at the same time, the CO2 that's on the backside of the cycle is released from the blood, it goes into our lungs, and as we exhale, the CO2 comes out of our lungs. So when we exercise, or actually just any sort of living, you breathe in oxygen and it goes into the blood, and then the blood is pumped from the heart out through the arteries, and then it goes into the muscles. Once in the muscles, you have this series of cascadingly smaller and smaller vessels that have oxygenated blood in them. And that oxygen is diffused into the muscles, and then it transfers into the venous system. And so the network where it goes from artery to vein is called a capillary. It's the capillary network. And then the used blood, or the deoxygenated blood, I should say, then goes into the venous system. Then it gets pumped back through the heart, back into the lungs, and then the CO2 is then expelled in the lungs like we talked about initially. So the VO2 max is basically the maximum amount of oxygen you can use during your intense physical exercise. So it's a measure of that entire system. So if you have bad lungs from, COPD, from smoking, from asthma, from whatever issues you might have in your lungs, you can't get that oxygen across into the blood, so you don't oxygenate the blood as well.
So there's one thing that could go wrong, right? If your red blood cells are inadequate, if you're anemic, if you have some, myelodysplastic problems where your bone marrow doesn't make blood appropriately, then you'd have a breakdown there, right? If you have a poor heart and you can't pump the blood to the muscles, that can cause a problem. If you have bad vascular system, the blood vessels themselves, or those little capillaries, if they're not efficient, if there's not very many of them, you don't get good diffusion of the oxygen into the muscle and the CO2 out, right? And then, of course, you have the muscle on the back end, which uses that oxygen for contraction. So what exactly do we need oxygen in our muscles for? Well, remember, mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. So the oxygen itself allows for ATP production by accepting the electrons in the final stage of the electron transport chain. So remember, the Krebs cycle itself doesn't actually use oxygen directly, but rather it's the final electron acceptor in this electron transport chain, which regenerizes NAD and FAD from NADH and FADH2. If you don't have oxygen, then what happens is the NADH and FADH2 build up, which then halts the Krebs cycle. And so you just have a lack of power production. So VO2 max measures this entire system: lungs, blood vessels, heart, capillaries, and muscle. Think of it as being similar to like a dyno machine on a car. Let's say you have a hot rod. Any kind of car will work, but let's say you have a hot rod and you want to know how much horsepower you have. You specifically want to know how much horsepower you have at the wheel, right? At the wheel, because that's where the rubber meets the road, literally, not just figuratively. They have these machines that you put on and it measures the horsepower at the wheel. And so the dyno itself actually gets the true horsepower at the wheel after the drivetrain loss. So, right, your engine power is one number. The engine makes all the combustion, does all this, and then it transfers through the transmission to a drive shaft. And that drive shaft runs back to the back wheels. On a hot rod, it would be on the back wheels, right? And so you lose power when you're going from the engine in the front, through the transmission, through the drivetrain, and then it goes into a differential and then to the tires. You're losing power. So your engine power isn't a good marker of the horsepower at the wheel. The dyno machine tells you the horsepower at the wheel. So you could do like an echocardiogram and it would tell you the power of the pump, right? It would tell you how well your heart's contracting. But the VO2 max is like the dyno machine, right? It tells you how the whole system works. Because let's just say you put a hot rod on a dyno machine and you don't have good air intake, right? So when you have a combustion engine, you have gas and you have air, and you have that combination. If you don't have good air intake, it's going to affect your power. If you don't have good gas, or you don't have adequate gas, it's going to affect your power. So air intake is like your lungs. The gas is like the blood vessel, right? And then you have the combustion. So that's going to be like the pump, the heart. And then that all gets converted into power through the transmission, which is sort of like the mitochondria. And then it goes directly to the wheels, the muscles. And so that gives you your power. So maybe not the best analogy, but it's the only thing I can really think of that really completely describes the global picture that the number that you have from a VO2 max produces. Another way to think of it maybe would be, let's just think about like finances. For those of you that aren't into hot rods or dyno machines. So let's say you have a retirement plan and you continue to save money and you put money in your retirement, your 401k, and that number just keeps building up and building up and building up. And so when you look at that, let's say you get to where you're 60, 65, whatever, and you've really focused on your 401k, and that's all you focused on, right? That number looks great. But then let's just say you tried to retire and maybe the number's really big, but let's say you still have a house payment, you still have a car payment. Let's say you had a lot of credit card debt. If you're only focusing on one number, whether it's in your health or your fitness, it can be very misleading. And so, of course, when you come up with a financial plan, you'd want to make sure that you had your 401k, right? And then you want to deduct from that any debt you have. So you'd want to know what your credit card debt is. You want to know what your car payment is. You want to know how much more you have due on your mortgage, because all of the inputs and outputs ultimately matter, because all of that boils down to a much smaller number than just what you see in the 401k. You have to reduce all of your expenses out of that. And then the number that's left, that's what you have to retire on. So just looking at one number is not adequate, right? You have to look at the whole picture in retirement. You have to look at the whole picture on a dyno machine to see how much power you're getting to the wheels. And then there's multiple steps each way, And the same is true with overall cardiovascular fitness. And so the VO2 max gives us that number. How is it measured? Well, the most precise way of measuring it is you go to an exercise medicine lab. You can Google this up. There's lots of videos on this. But basically, they hook you up to a mask. If you're a little claustrophobic, it's a little intense. So you have this mask on, and they actually entrain a set amount of oxygen. And so they know how much oxygen is going in, and then they have a device on there. So when you exhale, it's captured and they know how much CO2 is coming off. So remember the way that the oxygen is used in the muscle, and then the byproduct is CO2. So you want to know how much oxygen is going in, how much CO2 is coming out. And so then they put you on this treadmill and you run at maximum speed for about 20 minutes. So, you can't just shoot out of the gate and go as fast as you can, but you need to go as fast as you can consistently for about 20 minutes. As they do that, your heart rate goes up and they measure how efficient you are, and you can improve those numbers. And there's multiple equations, right? It has to do with the stroke volume, which is the cardiac output, how much blood squeezes from your heart multiplied by the number of times your heart's beating, right? And then you look at the diffusion of oxygen before and after in CO2. It's a complex calculation, but it's a relatively easy test to do. And most universities would have an exercise medicine lab where you could probably go pay $100, $150 and get this done. And then they'll give you a number and say, this is your VO2 max. Sometimes along with that, while you're doing it, they'll prick your finger and they'll check for lactate. And so once you sort of get to a certain point where you begin to spill over lactate, that's like your lactic threshold. And they can correlate that as well with VO2. That's the way you do it. That's the most accurate way to do it, but it's also kind of the most expensive way and the most detailed way. And if you live near a university or a place that has an exercise medicine lab, it's a great place to do it. But if you don't, there's other ways. All of these smartwatches have VO2 max abilities. They're not nearly as accurate, but they are worth having, and at least it gives you some idea. So it's estimated that the Apple Watch is within about 4 to 5% of an actual lab test. But there's been some research that shows that they may be off as high as 13%. But interestingly, they tend to underestimate with the Apple Watch. Now on Garmin's, they report that theirs were within about 5 to 10% of an exercise lab test. And both the Apple and the Garmin, even though they're not as accurate, they both tend to underestimate. And then they also tend to be further off the less physically fit someone is. So unfortunately, if you're not very physically fit and you just look at those numbers, it's a little disheartening because they underestimate it. But if you know that, at least it gives you some frame of reference. And then the Whoop bands also are reported to be fairly accurate as well in terms of VO2 max. So that's what VO2 max is, and that's how it's measured. So what are we going to do with that information? Well, since it's a mark of overall physical fitness and cardiovascular health, you want to try to make sure that you have that number as high as you can, right? Not only for endurance athletes, but just for life, right? There's a certain level of which it's sort of what's called the level of dependence, where you get down around, let's say 15, a VO2 max of 15, where you just can barely function on your own, right? You're just getting down to that level where you're becoming dependent on other people, right? You can't climb stairs or get out of bed or do the things you need to do, the activities of daily living. So what's a normal VO2 max? Let's start with ladies. So less than 29, an excellent VO2 max would be 49, right? That'd be like in just really stellar shape. An average VO2 max would be about 31 to 38, and then a poor VO2 max would be anything under 24. And that's if you're less than 29 years of age. Now, when you're in your 30s, right, 30 to 39, a poor VO2 max is less than 20. Average is 28 to 37, and excellent is 45. For a woman in her 40s, a poor VO2 max is less than 17. Average would be 25 to 35, and excellent would be 42. For a female in her 50s, 50 to 59, a poor VO2 max is less than 15, and average is 22 to 34, and excellent is 40. And then lastly, a female in her 60s, 60 to 69, a poor VO2 max is less than 13, average is 21 to 33, and excellent is 37. So you can see as we age, just naturally our VO2 max decreases. So a woman 60 to 69 poor is down around 13, right? That is near the level of dependence. So those numbers are different, right? They're dependent on age and sex. So let's just say a young man, 20 to 29, a poor VO2 max for him would be less than 36. Excellent for that age group would be 48 to 54. Superior would be greater than 55, and elite would be 80. So you think about like these guys riding in the Tour de France or these professional cyclists or professional runners, man, they have incredible VO2 maxes, 80 plus. So a man in his 30s, poor VO2 max is less than 35. Average, 45 to 52. Excellent, greater than 52. A man in his 40s, a poor is less than 35. Excellent is 43 to 51. And superior is 51. I won't go on with every age group. You can Google these up. So VO2 max is reported as milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of weight per minute. That's actually what we call the relative VO2 max, because that takes into account weight. The absolute VO2 max is different, but it's reported this way, milliliters per kilogram per minute, just most typically. So that's what's important. In addition to age and sex, activity level also makes a big difference. So if you're sedentary, your VO2 max is going to be much less. And then, of course, if you're an elite athlete, it's significantly higher, as we saw that. So what can we do to improve our VO2 max? What is it that we need to do that helps us? Well, think about weightlifting. If you want to get stronger, if you went down to the gym and you started, curling 5-pound weights, right? You're not going to see a lot of difference in just a typical person, right? If you're really deconditioned, that may be a good place to start. And there's nothing wrong with starting anywhere, right? If you have to start at a 2-pound weight, that's fine. Start there and build up. But if you have a reasonable amount of muscle mass, lifting or curling a 2-pound weight or a 5-pound weight over time isn't really going to make a difference, right? You're not straining the muscle and putting it under duress where it has to adapt and then get bigger. So what happens is if you want to hypertrophy your muscles, if you want to have stronger muscles, you put them under strain, you put them under resistance, and then you get damage to the muscles a little bit. You get these little micro tears, and then as they build, they model and they remodel and they hypertrophy and they get stronger and they adapt to the heavier weights. So that's why you have what's called progressive overload, right? You gradually increase the amount of weight, and it's not huge increases at any one time. But if you do 2-pound weights and you can do 20 of them, you're not going to have the same outcomes of, let's say you do a 30-pound weight and you can only do 4 to 6, right? Because what happens is you're straining that muscle so much and it's having to then come up with adaptive ways so that it can lift that weight. And the body's amazing in the way it adapts and does things it needs to do to survive. And so that's progressive overload. That's like in strength training. So VO2 max, it's not a whole lot different, right? It's sort of strength training for the cardiovascular system. So you hear about HIIT training, high intensity interval training, and that's a little bit about what the VO2 max is. What you're doing is you go out and you're just straining your heart, usually for like 3 to 5 minute intervals. And you're running or biking or rowing. You're doing some cardiovascular test, some cardiovascular event. Usually it's running. And you go as hard as you can for 4 minutes, trying to get your heart rate up to 100%, right? But that's difficult. So let's say you get it up to 90 to 95% of your maximum heart rate. And then you have 3 minutes of easy recovery, and you do that 4 times. That workout is called the Norwegian 4x4 workout. It's a total of 32-minute workout. But what happens is you're pushing to the very limit, and then you sustain it for 4 minutes. Now, it's different than a sprint, right? A sprint, let's say you do like a 100-yard sprint. You're going to be able to run 100 yards a whole lot faster than you can run any distance for 4 minutes. So you're going as hard as you can sustain for 4 minutes. You're trying to get that heart rate up. And so when you're getting that heart rate up, it has to pump faster, right? And it has to make adjustments faster. And then consequently, your blood vessels, they need to expand and contract appropriately based on what's going on. So when we run, we need to get plenty of blood to our heart and our lungs and our muscles, right? So we don't send a lot of our blood to our gut at the time when we're running. And so what happens is your body begins to make these adaptations, right? Your heart will begin to pump more efficiently. That is stroke volume. Remember, it's how much blood is squeezed out of your heart with each pump. And it will be more and more efficient at doing that. And when it gets more efficient at doing that, it doesn't have to pump as many times per minute. That's why when you see just a normal person, the average heart rate is anywhere from about 60 to 100 beats per minute. But when you see somebody that's in really good shape, whether it's a runner or a biker or athlete, somebody that's in some sort of cardiovascular shape, it's not uncommon for their heart rate to be in the 50s or 40s, or if they're really good, down into the 30s. Because what happens is with each squeeze of their heart, they're able to so efficiently squeeze out so much blood, and it courses through those veins. And then, of course, in addition to having a good, strong heart, you have a really responsive vascular system, right? All these blood vessels, arteries, veins, capillaries. And so they all are just much more efficient at doing what they do. So those are the adaptations that this training leads to. There's multiple VO2 max workouts, but basically they're all relatively similar in that they're 3 to 5 minutes of hard work, usually cardiovascular, on a treadmill, on a stationary bike. It could be running or on a regular bike, rowing, any of these things. 3 to 5 minutes of hard work, followed by about 3 minutes of recovery. And in that recovery, you want to really get that heart rate down. You don't want to stop, right? If you're running, you don't want to stop. You want to just slow down, right? Slow down, maybe not walk, but maybe a real slow jog, nice and easy, and then back at it for 3 to 5 minutes. And you do that about once a week. And what happens is you gradually begin to make these adaptations, and then your VO2 max goes up. And remember, the VO2 max decreases your risk of all-cause mortality, right? And so I guess a little bit of that is self-perpetuating because, if you're able to do all these things, then you know that your lungs are in good shape and your blood vessels are in good shape and your blood supply is in good shape and your muscles are good. Another thing that's interesting is as we become more and more healthy and our VO2 max gets better, we get really good at extracting the oxygen into our muscles so that they can be used in this process with the Krebs cycle and in the production of ATP, which then causes the contraction. So when you have the arteries and the veins and they're connected by these capillaries, as we get more and more fit, we begin to develop more and more capillaries. And so what happens is you just have all these sort of collateral capillaries in addition to our normal networks. And so there's just an increased efficiency of getting blood into the muscle. It extracts that oxygen. It gives off the CO2 and it gets pumped back to the heart. And then once it's back in the heart, it goes to the lungs, and then the diffusion of CO2 into the lungs. Then we exhale and out it goes. Again, the body is an absolute amazing machine, and VO2 max is just a really good marker. So if you have an opportunity to go to an exercise medicine lab, I think it's a great way to get a measure of your fitness. But if you have a Garmin or an Apple Watch or anything, they're all on there. And so you have to do a little digging to find them. They're not terribly difficult. In Garmin, their platform is called Garmin Connect. Let's say you're on the app and you go to Garmin Connect. On the bottom of the screen on the far right hand, there's a little tab called More. And if you hit that, MRE More, it'll pull up a whole list of things. And one of them is performance stats. And so if you click on performance stats, about the fifth one down is your VO2 max. And you click on that and it'll tell you what your VO2 max is. And interestingly, if you cycle and you use Garmin products when you cycle, and if you run and you use like a Garmin watch, it'll actually give you a VO2 max for both running and cycling. On the Apple Watch, you go into the health app. It's a little white icon with a red heart, and go to browse. At the bottom, it's got summary, sharing, and browse. Hit browse, and then go down to heart and hit heart. Just scroll down and you'll see cardio fitness, and it'll have your VO2 max on there. And remember, both of these tend to underestimate your actual VO2 max. So the number that you have on there on your Apple Watch or on your Garmin or your Whoop, they'll tend to underestimate. It's a good place to start. It's better than nothing. So I hope this was helpful. Going over VO2 max, it's a bit of a complicated equation, but it's a great overall gauge of fitness. And it's so important to longevity. It just correlates so great with longevity. And as it increases, it decreases all-cause mortality. So it's definitely a metric worth following, right? We get so fixated on weight and BMI and strength and speed and all these things, but VO2 max is a really good one, and it's becoming more readily available on the devices we have. So I would encourage you to find your VO2 max, and maybe as the concept of resolutions come up, if you have one of these devices and you can see what it is, you can then make an improvement, right? Oftentimes we can't change things until we measure them and know where we stand to then make a difference. Again, I hope this is useful. If you have any questions, please feel free to hit us up on any of our social media platforms or reach out to us on the BMIpodcast.com, our website.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI Podcast. See you then.